This brings me to our next speaker, Nick Cohen. Now, many of you will either know of Nick or have read his work, either through his regular writings on The Observer or through his many books, such as What's Left, which was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for Political Writing in 2008. If ever we wanted a theme for our conference, it would be freedom of speech. Christopher Hitchens once said, "It's not enough to have free speech. People must learn to speak freely." And that is what Nick Cohen does week after week. Nick Cohen is the most eloquent supporter of secularism, and we are proud to include him as an honorary associate of the Secular Society. Please give your warmest welcome to Nick Cohen.
Well, hello there, it's very encouraging to see so many people here. I was at, until a few minutes ago, I was at a punishment course, really. It's for speeding drivers. Instead of getting points on your license, you go for a 4-hour speeding course. I'd gone over the limit in East Anglia, and my excuse was, well, it's so flat, what else are you meant to do? Didn't really wash. And while I was there, I said, I hope we get out on time, because I got to speak to the National Secular Society, to the woman sitting next to me. And the woman sitting next to me said, well, what's the point of the National Secular Society? You've won, haven't you? We're a secular society. And I thought about having an argument, then got into crash distances and all of that, and so I left it. But we're not, because although Pragna Patel mentions that one of the demands that's come in the last 25 years is for an extension of the blasphemy law, that's rather missing a point. Missing the point is we have a de facto blasphemy law in Britain, in Western Europe, in most of the democracies. Only it's not a law that's been passed by any parliament or congress with democratic legitimacy. It's not enforced by judges with rules governing how fair trials are conducted. It's not no jury decides whether the defendant is innocent or guilty. The defendant has no right to insist that he or she is only found guilty if the case against him or her is proven beyond reasonable doubt, and there is most certainly no right of appeal. We have an effective blasphemy law based on the threat of violence, and if anything, the last few weeks have just proved this. A bunch of obscurantist Christians in California make a trashy amateur video, and American embassy officials are killed, people are murdered across the Middle East. Salman Rushdie releases his autobiography, and someone in Iran decides to return to the fatwa of Valentine's Day 1989 and offer more money to any Muslim who would kill him. The presence of these threats, and they are constant, and I see it all the time working in the media, I see the fear in editors' eyes, in publishers' eyes, in broadcasters' eyes, is quite a strong argument for censorship to their minds. They think if we provoke, we will have blood on our hands, maybe our own blood on our hands. We will certainly put our journalists in danger, or we will disturb civil peace. And what is missing from this account, this dominant account in the establishment, as Pragna mentioned, which almost got us into a ludicrous situation where we have a de jure law rather than de facto law banning criticism of religion, is something I find almost laughable, is that people have now developed this whole theory that to insult Prophet Muhammad, to criticize the origins, the founding myths of Islam, is Islamophobic. But look what they put in place when they say that. They picture this monolithic block of the Muslims, 1 billion or so people around the world, who really, to the minds of Western establishments, are little better than truculent children. An insult, a slur. You cannot expect them, dear boy, to behave as Westerners would, to shrug it off or argue back. You must expect them to behave like naughty children and run around screaming and having tantrums. The result is a huge system of self-censorship, which, as Pragna suggested, overwhelmingly hurts immigrants to this country, passes them over to the most reactionary elements in their communities, even if they don't particularly want to be in what is patronisingly called their communities. It is also absurd. My last book was about freedom of speech, about censorship, called You Can't Read This Book. And one thing I did to try and encourage people, like people in this room, is go back through the great writers in favour of freedom in English literature. Because it's very important to remember that we are not on our own in the present. There are good traditions across the world and in this country, I would say, if it's not a fake national pride, particularly in this country, that we can draw on. And in John Milton's, the first great essay against censorship in the English language is Areopagita of 1644. One thing he concentrates on, being a writer, he concentrates a lot, is the absurdity of censorship. And he asks, what type of person would want to be a censor? Well, that's the kind of question that answers itself, isn't it? I mean, who actually wants to censor? It wouldn't be a writer of any talent. He or she would want to do his or her own work. Who wants to actually sit down and, instead of doing something worthwhile of their lives, stop other people writing? Almost by definition, someone who wants to judge writing and be a censor is unfit to judge writing and be a censor. And the history of what has been going on with religious censorship in our time contains a very strong surreal element. I was determined, despite my editor's incredulity, to get the story of the Jewel of Medina into my book, which, more than anything else, emphasises a point which I constantly throw at interviewers whenever they say, but what about people going too far? I say, you don't seem to understand. This film in California is trash. It's made by one bunch of religious fundamentalists to infuriate another bunch of religious fundamentalists. We've got to be against them both. But more to the point, you don't understand the point of political extremism if you think if you treat episodes, if you isolate each episode and say, well, should she have done that? Should he have done this? The point about extremism, both secular in terms of fascism and communism, and religious in terms of Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, and Christianity, is there always has to be something. If it's not one thing, it's another. There has to be something to feed to their supporters, to keep them inflamed, to keep them in a constant stage of politically profitable outrage. The culture war can never end. And so, by far, the best example of this is from, I should explain, even if it's not glaringly obvious to you, I'm a middle-aged, rather grumpy male, and not a natural target audience for romantic fiction, but a lovely, sweet author of romantic fiction from the American West called Sherry Jones, who wrote a book called The Jewel of Medina. I'll give you a sample of her prose. It begins, "Join me on a journey to another time and place, to a harsh, exotic world of saffron and sword fights, of desert nomads living in camel hair tents, of caravans laden with Persian carpets and frankincense, of flowing coloured robes and cold, darkened eyes." It was a romantic novel, a romantic historical novel about Aisha, whom the Prophet Muhammad got engaged to at 6 and married at 9. Now I know what you're thinking. And the hadiths, all the official histories of the biographies of the Prophet, which incidentally come from about 200 years after his death and are no more valuable as historical records of the life of Muhammad than the Gospels are for the life of Jesus. They don't say, guess everybody got married at 9, when Aisha was 9. But Sherry Jones was such a sweet romantic novelist whose aim was to show that Muhammad was fairly egalitarian in his attitudes to women's and has got a bad rap from feminists, that she strove mightily not to cause offence. So after Muhammad marries Aisha, he simply kisses the child goodbye. Consummating the marriage cannot be further from his mind, and Sherry Jones wrote, Muhammad said, "You cannot come with me, not yet. It would not be proper. You must remain with your parents until you grow up." She remains with her parents. At the age of 14, Sherry Jones insists to her intense frustration, Aisha's marriage to Muhammad is still not consummated. Every day flowered with hope. Would Muhammad visit me today, then drops its petals like tears, the weeks drag by to the funeral procession. She shows Mohammed her breasts. He doesn't take the hint. It goes on and on and on until finally, when she's a young woman, puberty is over, the marriage is consummated. What more can you do? Sherry Jones sends this book to Random House New York, who love it, give her a $100,000 advance, think it would be a big sale in the woman's market. Copies of the book are then sent out, and one goes to a white academic at Texas University, who reads this book, which has bent over backwards to avoid any possibility of saying, the practice across the ancient world and well into medieval Europe, and indeed in much of the world today, of girls marrying old men, and then effectively being raped by old men, didn't happen in this particular case. She still insists it's an insult to Muslims. Random House are so frightened by those words, they pull the book. They pull the book in the land of the First Amendment. They just pull the book. The academic tells a Muslim professor and her colleague, who quite innocently puts on his website saying, my friend Denise tells me this book coming out as an insult to Muslims. He then reads books, says it's nothing of the sort. He meets Sherry Jones, they all get on fine. But all it took was for a hysterical academic to use that phrase, this book is an insult for Islam, and it's out. It's on the web. After the fuss dies down, another publisher picks up the book, thinks it's all been the fuss about nothing. A British publisher called Gibson Square buys the rights, and then a few months later, his home is firebombed. So here you have a romantic novelist from the American West writing a slushy novel. A professor from Texas makes wholly unfounded criticisms of it, but the very fact it is criticised is enough for extremists to firebomb the home of a publisher in Islington. And this, more than anything else, is the point I want to emphasise. If they hadn't firebombed his home, they would have found something else. This is where the case against censorship breaks down, because it fails to understand the mentality of religious fanaticism. It fails to it blames everything on the provocateur, who's normally always a Western provocateur. It fails to understand that fascism or clerical fascism, the damn thing has a life of its own. It's not only failing to understand, it's afraid to admit it exists. I said this at the last meeting of National Secular Society I spoke to. We have an immense problem in academia, in journalism, in the arts in Britain, in that we all like to pose as if we're dissidents in a dictatorship or part of a revolutionary underground. We constantly emphasize our bravery and our courage, even though we say so ourselves. We constantly say that we are challenging establishments, transgressing boundaries, shattering taboos, that we speak truth to power. One of the many problems with that, apart from the fact it's normally nonsense, is that we cannot acknowledge the fact of censorship and self-censorship in Britain. Because what if I pose to you as this great truth-seeking, establishment-challenging journalist, what would you think of me if I said, actually, certain topics are just off limits? Critiques of the founding myth of radical Islam, critiques of Muhammad, or take it away from radical Islam. One reason why the banking crash came out of the blue is, to be frank, journalists, financial journalists know that if you challenge a big, rich institution in the city, you will get a libel writ. And that will cost you tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands or £1 million if you fight it in the English courts, and newspapers are going bust everywhere. The internet is destroying us, and we can't afford to fight it. But how many financial journalists have you seen do mea culpas that the most extraordinary crash since 1929 has happened on our watch, and explain to the readers why they didn't do it? They don't want to say, well, we and our editors are afraid. What does that fear consist of? The easy thing to say is that we're just physical cowards, we're frightened of violence, and people are. Editors and publishers are very, very frightened of the bomb in the office or the knife in the back. But as Pragna said with, I thought, quite dialectical subtlety, it goes on from that. Because we cannot admit our fear, because we cannot admit the fact of censorship and self-censorship, we make excuses. we start saying, well, we don't want to be Islamophobic in the case of Islam. And as Pragner suggests as well, there are good reasons for worrying about that. There is anti-Muslim racism in Britain. There are racists who make no distinctions between fellow travellers of Al-Qaeda and most liberal Muslims and ex-Muslims. You suddenly find, I've noticed as well, the most extraordinary conservative journalists suddenly developing a passion for gay rights because essentially they want to annoy the Muslim Council of Britain, not because they have any, any feeling for it. And finally, beyond all that, there just lies, and I think this applies particularly in state institutions like universities, like the BBC, there's just the fear of speaking out of turn. That might not seem much, but to go back to the history of radical thought about freedom of speech, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, the finest book against censorship ever written. The censorship Mill is complaining, is worried about, is not the censorship of the state. The Victorian state was tiny. Probably borough councils in London are bigger than the Victorian state. It was the censorship of received opinion. It was the censorship of a lot of it religious, but of the Grundyism of the mid-Victorian age. And he said, although that might not be as frightening as the secret police, it's more pervasive, it's more insidious. One thing I hope to do in my writing, and particularly in my book on censorship, is to emphasize the importance of at least being honest about being a coward. You know, if you are a writer, an artist, a lecturer, and you cannot speak out, and there are subjects that are off limits. If you're a doctor who wants to speak out against the shocking failure to mount a single prosecution for female genital mutilation in Britain, the willingness of the police, and there was a police officer on BBC Newsnight, senior officer in the Metropolitan Police, a few weeks ago, who said, actually, we think it's good there are no prosecutions. We think we're doing the right thing by not prosecuting. If you want to speak out that, but you're frightened, you must say so. You must communicate to the public the fact that censorship and self-censorship is going on. You will get a lot of challenges. I know, I get them all the time. And as Pragner said, the language of the liberal left has been corrupted and turned on its head and twisted for perverse purposes. And you'll be accused of all kinds of religious phobias and racism. And although some of the people who use this language are malicious, a lot aren't. They are worried. They are genuinely worried about intolerance spreading and people's fear of the other. I mean, I think there are two arguments that you can put together. The first is it just depends almost on your outlook on life. I'm an optimist rather than a pessimist. I do not believe that the majority of my fellow citizens in Britain are closet Nazis, just waiting for a moment to just dress up in black leather and invade Poland. I genuinely don't. I think that most people in this country are at least open to some kind of reasonable debate. I think that as we have seen, civil society has its own remedies when racist extremists, not religious extremists, they're still protected, but neo-Nazi groups stick their head above the parapet. You don't need censorship laws to stop them. Ridicule and argument is enough. You know, there is a mentality that has grown since the 1960s that is, if something is objectionable and dangerous, the only way to deal with it is a law. No, it's not. To go back to Mill, that's what Mill was arguing against. Mill realised that there are far other ways of confronting opinions than just the law. Well, that confrontation, that received wisdom can sometimes be a received wisdom for good, and it can be used. And indeed is used almost on a daily basis against racist extremists. I don't know if you saw, there was a story a few weeks ago about some drunk student in Cardiff, I think it was, who tweeted some racist remarks about a black footballer who had a heart attack on the pitch at Tottenham. The police arrested him. Even before that, he had thousands and thousands of people laying into him, beating him up online. The guy was a sort of bleeding wreck long before the cops came to him. So that is the first thing to understand. The second point is this. it applies to everyone in this room who ever speaks at public meetings or speaks at rallies like this, is that it's not hard to beat, I don't know, a Holocaust denier in open argument. It really isn't. And if you can't do it in open argument without wanting to call for the police or turning to violence, you really shouldn't be in the debating business at all. And you should get out of the way and make way for someone who can. Now, I'd say this as a sort of classical liberal in all circumstances, but when we're in a situation where we're not allowed, where somehow the strange trajectory of liberal thought since the 1968 generation, which throws up these prohibitions and in many countries' laws because it wants to defend society against sexist, racist, and homophobes. Fine, I'm all against sexist, racist, but when those prohibitions are used to stop you criticising religious extremists who are also sexist, racist, and homophobes, you feel that the period of history has come to an end and ended in an absurdity, to go back to my original theme. So if there's one thing I would like you to take away from all of this, is to just build up your defences a bit and thicken your skin a bit and be ready for when you speak out against divinely sanctioned prejudice and ignorance and indeed discrimination. Be ready to be attacked and to have your answers ready and to throw into the face of those who criticise you, particularly if they claim to be liberal-minded, particularly if they claim to be against misogyny and against racism, against homophobia, and to just make them feel absurd. Thank you very much.
How do you feel about the censorship of Holocaust deniers?
Well, as I said in my speech, I don't think it should be illegal.
No.
I really don't. It's interesting in France, where it is illegal, and there are all kinds of laws, far stricter privacy laws than even we have. There's even talk of a law against denying the Armenian genocide of 1915. And you could say, well, you know, Turkish nationalists who want to minimize the massacres of the Armenians are revolting people. Holocaust deniers are revolting people. And if we have all these laws, and there's also all kinds of laws against upsetting religious minorities, if we have all these laws, you will get a happy multicultural society. You don't in France at all. At the last French presidential election, almost 20% of the people voted for Marine Le Pen's National Front parties. It's wrong to call it neo-Nazi, but that's where its roots are. And about 11% of people voted for a far-left candidate who's essentially representing the communists. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why that happens in France and doesn't happen in Britain, but one is, in France, with all these laws against freedom of speech, including laws against Holocaust denial, it is very easy for the average citizen to think that, if you like, the received version, the official version they see on the news, they read in press, is a lie. And some kind of conspiracy in the elite is suppressing the truth. You know, you think you have a law for one purpose, and you go along with it, but it has other consequences. One of the finest lines of Saul Bellow, my favourite Saul Bellow lines, is there is no accuracy or precision to suppression. Push down on one thing, you push down on the thing adjoining. You have laws against Holocaust denial in France, and you think, oh, well, we're just stopping neo-Nazis and some this and this. But then the cultural effects of a society where opinions are banned are often uncontrollable.
It's interesting to, when I'm observing on the news and reading the newspapers, that with the increasing prevalence of technology like the internet, and therefore bringing across different political ideas that are not, that was never really considered in many of the communities around the world. Do you feel, well, it's a hypothesis, is it just that they say that a wounded animal is a most dangerous animal? Is it just that religion as a mainstream idea, seeing that it's being challenged by all these different ideas, and that basically this is the last strikeout before it dies out into mediocrity?
Well, I hesitate to trample on Professor Dawkins' patch, and I understand he'll be talking afterwards. It's very hard to say religious belief is declining. That's one thing. Very, very hard. There's some evidence, although all these samples are biased, that the number of people who are religious has increased on planet Earth, and there's good reason for that, because Soviet communism collapsed, and under Soviet communism you had a huge advantage in proclaiming yourself an atheist. Now you don't. What has happened is something more subtle, and I'll try to explain it. 200 years ago, if you were a believer, it doesn't matter what you are, Muslim, Jew, Christian, you would know that the finest minds in the world also believed in a supernatural explanation for the universe. You would, they might disagree with you. If they were Protestants and you were a Catholic, you might think they were dreadful heretics and would go to hell. And if they were Catholic, if you were, and vice versa. But whatever your theological difference with them, you would know that they accepted the broad supernatural explanation of the universe. Isaac Newton, combined his time between discovering the laws of motion and trying to understand the prophecies in the book of Revelations. He saw no contradiction between that. Now that's no longer possible. You are a believer, and as soon as you reach some level of knowledge, you will know that the greatest minds in the world, most of them, 80–90%, reject supernatural explanations. Or if they have them, it is a God so remote. It's just a God who sets up the Big Bang in the first second to make sure all the molecules tick in the right way and then disappears. It is God so remote from the interventionist gods of the holy books, it might well not be a God to you. And that to me is one reason why religion, which produced such sublime literature, architecture, art throughout human history, now cannot produce a high culture. Because if you're reaching for a high culture, religion is no longer a part of it. What that does, I think, is make people very defensive, to go back to your question. Make people, I mean, for goodness sake, the study of history teaches you that there's never been a golden age of religious toleration on earth, but make people far more wary of learning, of their children getting ideas which their parents can't control, or the religious leaders in their society can't control. It's not that the numbers of people who believe in gods is necessarily declining. It is that religion now knows itself to be intellectually on the back foot, and in some ways to respond is to be like your typical Anglican clergyman and develop a theology that is so wishy-washy and so liberal it's barely a theology at all, but then to remain in touch with the scientific revolution. Another way is to become ultra-reactionary and aggressive and defensive, and I think that's what's happening.
Considering that we are living in an interdependence world, particularly economically, and as it is in the West, freedom of speech or opinion is, of course, a right, which I will stand for it all the time. What's happening after this film, there is a general consensus in the Arab world, especially between top-level writers, to say that why is it you are criminalizing the Holocaust, anybody talking about the Holocaust, while you are not criminalizing blasphemy, or it's not blasphemy, an insult to the Prophet. And the trouble is, even with those who are most broad-minded and they see and they condemn the outrageous behavior, reaction to this, still they are saying, okay, why not? So right. What do you see, where do you see a way
Well, first of all, Britain does
Thank
not
you.
have a law criminalising Holocaust denial, nor does America. We breached the First Amendment. Second, the point you raised is a very interesting one. To go back to my earlier point about you shouldn't infantilise people in the poor world, regard them as a block. The religious extremists are constantly studying Western societies, as indeed is Putin's Russia. There's a station called Russia Today, and all it is about is the hypocrisies of the West. Nothing at all about Pussy Riot or faked elections or anything like that. All it's about is the hypocrisies of the West, and of course they use them. I've no problem with that, because I think that we ought to fight restraints on our freedom. We ought to fight hypocritical measures by our own governments, and Lord knows there are enough of them to fight. But if you can't fight them for your own sake and the sake of your fellow citizens, you should say to yourself, well, we ought to fight them for the sake of people in Iran or Libya or Moscow, whose oppressors use our own leaders' hypocrisy to justify the oppressions of their own people. So there you go. You have a double reason for struggling for liberty.
Thank you. Could you please have a very, very generous round of applause for Nick Cohen?